Hello, and a very warm welcome to the StudioCanal Presents podcast. My name is Simon Brew from Film Stories magazine, and this is a regular podcast celebrating one of the biggest and deepest film libraries in the world. StudioCanal's extensive library of over 6,000 films brings together cinema from around the globe. There are British independents such as Journeyman and You Were Never Really Here, vintage classics such as Hobson's Choice and The Cruel Sea, plus a dash of muscular action with Red Heat and Rambo First Blood Part 2. We're going to be doing our best to explore it all in this podcast. In this episode, we're looking back at one of Francis Ford Coppola's very best films, 1974's Palme d'Or-winning thriller The Conversation. The film stars Gene Hackman, playing against type and in one of his very best roles, as a surveillance expert who, well, I don't really want to spoil where it goes. I'm going to be joined for this conversation by triple Oscar-winning editor, writer, director and sound designer Walter Murch. He's the sound designer and editor on The Conversation, and I'll be talking to him just after this clip from the film.
What are you doing here?
Take it easy. I'm just a messenger. Brought you a drink.
I don't want your drink. Why are you following me?
I'm not following you. I'm looking for you. It's a big difference.
How'd you know I was here?
Oh, it's a conventional wiretappers, isn't it? Oh, excuse me. Surveillance and security technicians. It was a snap.
Look, I'm telling you, I'm not giving those tapes to anybody but the director.
Yeah, I know what you told me, Mr. Call.
All right, what's the message?
We want you to deliver the tapes on Sunday at 1 o'clock. The director will be there. He'll accept the tapes from you in person.
You tell him I'll think about it.
I am delighted to be joined for this special episode of the StudioCanal Presents podcast by, well, something of a legend, really. The triple Oscar-winning editor, writer, director, sound designer, Walter Murch. Hello, thank you, and thank you for appearing on this podcast.
Thank you, Simon.
One thing we do like to find out a little bit about of our guest just before we begin is kind of just like a really early film memory of yours. Was there something that really gave you the film bug in the first place? Was there a film that you saw when you were very young that really just excited you?
The very first film I ever saw was Bambi. My father took me to see it, and it frightened me, so I ducked down under the seats. I guess it's kind of an aversion therapy, but I overcame it. And I think the film that opened up some doors for me was Bergman, The Seventh Seal. I saw it when I was 15, and I left the theater thinking, somebody made this film.
Yeah.
Meaning his personality was so strong that it blew away the other concepts that I had about how films were made, which were very vague.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's maybe two steps from thinking somebody made this film. Well, I am somebody, ...
Yeah.
Maybe I can make a film. And at that age, I didn't take it that far, but the seed was planted.
I really love that. The fact that Bambi was your earliest memory explains a little bit of the terrific film you directed, Return to Oz, which caused me no shortage of trauma as well. I really loved that film enormously. We're here talking about, a film that's 50 years old.
Yeah.
Francis Ford Coppola's 1974 movie, The Conversation. When you came to The Conversation, you were at quite the period in your career. And this, as I understand it, was the first time you'd edited a feature film. You were working on machines that you hadn't worked on before. And I think you described in an interview you given before about how you were hyper aware of your inexperience going into it. So can you take us how you got involved with it and maybe the first few days of working on it?
Yes, I had worked with Francis on The Rain People.
Yeah.
And then I'd worked with George Lucas on THX 1138 and American Graffiti, and worked with Francis on The Godfather. So I'd had those films under my belt as a sound designer.
Yeah.
and a re-recording mixer, but I hadn't edited a feature film before. And Francis looked at me. He wanted to do this film in between Godfather 1 and Godfather 2. And, he was familiar with me. I was familiar with him. And he said, well, you're a sound person, and this film is about a sound recordist, so you know the character because that's who you are. So why don't you edit the film as well as doing the sound for it? And I had wanted to move into picture editing, so I thought, fantastic. But as soon as I made that decision, I thought, this is scary because here's Francis Coppola, who's just had a huge success with The Godfather, and I'm an inexperienced editor, and this is a strange-looking film.
Yeah.
So maybe it will work and maybe it won't. But if it doesn't work, then of course they'll blame it on the editing by this inexperienced 28-year-old.
28 years old, and you're editing a really complex film as well, to my eyes, once you go into the nuances of it. You said there you felt a little bit of the fear going in and a little bit of the nervousness. How did you get over that? Was it a case of once you're working on it, you've just got no choice and that kind of just dies down a little bit?
Yeah, you're diving into the pool. The moment before you dive, you think there might be crocodiles in there. But eventually fate gives you a push, and you dive in, and then it becomes a series of day-to-day problems and things to be taken advantage of. And you just move from day to day, and eventually things begin to click.
Yeah.
And then you think, well, I can do this, I think. You never ultimately know until the film is finished, but that feeling is certainly what carries you through on a day-to-day basis while the film is being shot, and then once it's in post-production.
I mean, you mentioned there a little bit earlier on that Francis Ford Coppola was between The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, but you were hardly not on the busy side yourself. As I understand it, this was crossing over with your work on American Graffiti. Was there much bleed between the projects?
No, they were happening right at the same time. Francis began to shoot Conversation at the end of November of 1972 when we were in the middle of getting ready to mix American Graffiti. So for the first 2 months or so of working on the Conversation, I was wearing two different hats. One of them was editing the sound on Graffiti and then going to dailies and talking about the editing of the Conversation. Luckily, I was working with an associate editor, Richard Chu, who went on to edit One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Star Wars. He hadn't had any feature editing experience either at that point, but he was able to keep the ball rolling in a sense until I was finished with the mix of American Graffiti and then could dedicate full time to Conversation.
You're talking here about two films that we revere as classics now, but by the sounds of it, when you're in the midst of it, they're the two projects just in front of you. You can't deal with them in any way other than that.
Yeah.
When did you know you were on the Conversation? Because you said that Francis started shooting at the end of 1972. How much run-up did you get to it? How aware were you of it beforehand?
I'd been talking to him since September about editing it, and he gave me the screenplay and then said, I've got some problems with this version of the screenplay. Think about how to solve those problems. And one of them was the issue of there apparently is a murder in an adjacent hotel room.
Yeah.
And Harry hears all kinds of violence through his secret microphones. He's in the next room. And then he falls asleep, kind of out of shell shock, and wakes up, uses his passkey expertise to get into the other hotel room. Yeah. And it's perfectly clean, as if nothing happened. And he walks around the room looking for signs of the murder, and nothing, no blood, it looks perfect. And he goes into the bathroom, looks behind the shower in the bathtub, and this has echoes of Psycho, which had been made about 10 years earlier. What will we find in the shower? Nothing. And then he hears a little tinkling sound from the toilet. And he's kind of an obsessive person. And he goes over to the toilet, and this is my idea, was he flushes the toilet to get rid of that sound, and blood comes out of the toilet as if the people who had cleaned up the room had thrown everything down the toilet, and it got stuck down there, and now it was all coming out of the toilet. So that was the idea I tossed to him, and he wrote it into the screenplay.
Francis Ford Coppola's level of cooperation you've talked about before in interviews, but it does sound like it's a meritocracy of ideas.
Yeah, that was the goal of American Zoetrope when we started it in 1979, was to make it the collaborative kind of filmmaking that we all remembered, George Lucas and Francis and myself, from film school. We were all film school graduates. And in that kind of environment, unlike studio environments, there's no or very little hierarchy. Everyone can do everything and everyone can contribute ideas. The director is ultimately the one who approves of an idea, but it's a very open hierarchy. And our goal was to keep that going and yet make professional films.
The opening sequence of the film, as we look at this square and we look at this conversation just gradually starting to take place. I mean, again, from the outside looking in, when I watch that at heart, that seems very simple at first before the complexities really bleed into it. Can you talk about editing that sequence together? Because it only occurred to me on the second or third time of watching it. I'm not entirely sure where some of the audio is coming from, the little misdirections that you're kind of putting into that. I'm just wondering, was there a wildly different version of that? I mean, it looks pretty near perfect to me. And I'm just wondering how much work it took just to get to that version of it.
Yeah, no, it pretty much fell into the place that you see it.
Yeah.
It was complex getting there because Haskell Wexler, who was the cinematographer on that scene, and Francis had decided to shoot it as if it was a secret documentary. So it was covered by 4 cameras shooting simultaneously. And every time there was a new take, which lasted about 10 minutes, then the camera positions were changed and the actors, went into it again. And the cameramen operating those hidden cameras never knew exactly where the people were going to be. So it has this subterfuge quality to it. The complications of that from an editorial point of view is it's exactly like editing a documentary. What I wound up doing was making a grid, kind of tic-tac-toe crossword puzzle of every line of dialogue and every camera position, of which there were probably 24 ultimately, 6 different takes with 4 cameras shooting at the same time. And then I put a cross where there was a line of dialogue on camera.
Yeah.
So that allowed me to kind of also like a game of Tetris, to guide myself through this maze of images, but it worked. Of course, then there's the subsequent work that was done on the sound.
Yeah.
There was a technical problem during shooting, which was that the actors had body mics. They were transmitting via radio.
Yeah.
But that was in the middle of San Francisco, and it was full of microwave interference. So every 15 seconds, there would be a kind of a wide, distorting sound that would come in and ruin everything.
Yeah.
At the end of that session, I took the 2 actors, Fred Forrest and Cindy Williams, and went with them to another park in San Francisco, which was in a more residential, quiet neighborhood. And I just walked with them using a portable tape recorder, and they said the lines of the conversation. It would be called a wild track. We weren't shooting camera or anything, but I had that as a cover. And it proved to be very useful. Probably in the end, I'm guessing maybe 40% of what you hear is from that session rather than the sync session.
Who started this conversation anyhow?
You did.
didn't learn it.
Yes, you did. You just don't remember it. Pretend like I just told you a joke.
Does it bother you
What?
walking around in circles?
Oh, look, that's terrible.
It's not hurting anyone.
Neither are we. Oh, God.
I have to ask Walter Murch, are you any good at Tetris? You strike me straight away as a puzzle solver.
No.
No.
but that's what it's like.
That second recording that you took when you took the actors away was the one where we get a slightly different, I don't want to go too spoilery for those who've not seen it, but a slightly different line reading at the end, if memory serves, which wasn't discovered by audiences for quite a while. That almost sounded like the filmmaker's secret. Is that how it was?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't discovered by us until right near the end of the film. Francis was already in New York shooting Godfather 2.
Yeah.
And I was alone mixing the film in San Francisco. And we had editorially over months struggling to get audiences to understand who the victim was and who the perpetrator was, because during most of the film, Harry Call, which is to say us, the Gene Hackman character, thinks that the couple is in danger.
Yeah.
What we learn at the end of the film is that they're actually the murderers, and it's the big boss who is in danger.
Yeah.
But it was hard to get that idea across because the entire film is told from Harry Call's point of view. There's no way that we could go into a kind of a Midsummer Murders wrap-up at the end where you say, here's what really happened. So while I was mixing the film, probably at 2 o'clock in the morning, I thought, I remember a slightly different reading of that line. Let me go find it. So I rummaged around and found a line where instead of saying he'd kill us if he had the chance, Fred Forrest says he'd kill us if he had the chance, which kind of has an invisible ... after it, meaning, therefore, we had better kill him. He doesn't say that, but that's the implication. And that I put that in as the final reading of that line and finished the mix, took it to New York to show Francis. I explained to him what I had done. So he knew in advance, watching the film, what was going to happen. And at the end, he said, "No, I like it. Let's keep it." And that's how it came to be.
I want to know. Do you think we can do this?
Later in the week. Sunday, maybe.
Sunday, definitely.
Jack Tar Hotel. 3 o'clock. Room 773.
He'd kill us if he got the chance.
I don't know if you're familiar with the 1992 film Sneakers, but I spoke to the director of that, Phil Alden Robinson, once, and it's a thriller where he plays the same piece of audio 6 or 7 times and gives the audience a big clue without the audience knowing it's a clue. And he talked about the vulnerability of putting the clues and that audio open to analysis so much in front of an audience and how he was almost second guessing himself, would it work? Strikes me on the conversation, it's almost 10 times more difficult that the whole film invites us to analyze audio. I'm just wondering how you felt that the pressure and the complexities of that, knowing that the work you were putting out, you were almost asking us to kind of work it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's not me, it's Francis.
Yeah.
But then I'm the editor of it. But you put your finger right on the central idea of why Francis wanted to make the film.
Yeah.
It's kind of a Rashomon in reverse. Yeah. In that the conversation is repeated exactly the same every time, and yet as the film develops, you see it in different contexts. And so you, the audience, are allowed to interpret it very differently. Yeah, that was the idea behind the film, the inspiration of making the film itself.
It's a few years ago that I read your book, In the Blink of an Eye, a really tremendous book. And you talked in there about Gene Hackman blinking in the conversation. And you talk there about you got a glimmer of basically the challenge of it on your first picture editing job, where you kept finding that Gene Hackman would blink very close to the point where I decided to cut it. And you describe how from that point on, you worked out almost that human beings are treating blinks like cuts. And I just wonder if that was a revelatory moment for you, because I'd never read anything quite like that before.
Yeah, no, it was a big revelation. It kept happening. I would look at the film and then I would decide to cut at a certain point. And usually that decision happened maybe a few frames before Gene Hackman would blink. So he and I, even though he was on the screen, he and I were kind of in sync with each other. And, you know, whether I was picking up his blinking subconsciously or whether we were considering the moment, and essentially he was deciding with his blink to think about something else. And that's exactly what a cut is, where we hold a shot for as long as it can hold.
Yeah.
And then we cut to another shot asking the audience to think about something else. And where that really kind of landed on me, again, got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and went out to get some breakfast. And I ran across an interview with John Huston, who had just made Fat City. And he was talking to the interviewer, Louise Sweeney, and said, "Look at me. Now look at that lamp. Now look back at me. Do you see what you did?" And she said, "No." He said, "You blinked in between me and the lamp. That's what a cut is." And so that, you know, I have to thank both Gene Hackman and John Huston for the inspiration of that idea.
Did you ever talk to Gene Hackman about his blinking? Did you tell him about the
I've never talked to any actor about that. So
I don't think it's particularly well known for those, well, inevitably to those new to the film, that the conversation finished with 10 pages left to be shot. I'm just wondering, how vulnerable was the conversation? How much did you feel that it came close to not happening even after shooting had begun?
You know, every film is kind of on a tightrope. Conversation definitely was, because it's such an unusual film about an unusual person. That was one of Francis's other ideas. He wanted to make a film about an anonymous person who, if you see that kind of person in another film, he maybe is on screen for 2 minutes. You know, Gene Hackman is on screen for the whole film. So, you know, it was also being pinched by Godfather 2 and just the need that Francis had to dedicate himself totally to Godfather 2. And it reached a point where we hadn't been able to lock the film. I think it was in October of 73.
Yeah.
And Francis finally threw in the towel and he said, "Let's just stop editing. I can't do both films at the same time." And of course, to me, this was a disaster because, you know, again, who did Francis get to edit the film? This kid. So I went for a long run thinking about what I should do. And I phoned Francis up after that and said, "Give me another week. I have some ideas." And I put some of those ideas in place, and then took the film to where Francis was shooting at the time, which was up in Lake Tahoe, screened the film, and he said, "No, this works, let's lock it." So that allowed us to complete the film, which also allowed Godfather 2 and The Conversation to come out in the same year.
You wrote in your book about the process of testing films, and you say in there that all of the films you've worked on have been tested before large audiences except The Conversation and The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And you describe in your book about Francis Ford Coppola's way of testing things is to screen the films as much as he can at any stage, and no matter how unfinished they were. If he was off doing Godfather 2 at that point and leaving you almost independently to do the edit on The Conversation, how was it being tested? How was it being put before audiences?
During the summer of 73, he was not yet shooting.
Yeah.
So he would come back to San Francisco from wherever he happened to be, scouting locations and stuff. He would come back every 3 weeks or 4 weeks. We would then have a screening with a small audience, maybe 10 people. There was never any big audience preview of The Conversation, nor was there on Godfather. That's another film that never previewed.
Yeah.
We had small friends and family screenings, and Francis would also invite people who had nothing to do with cinema at all, just to get a kind of a wild card opinion. And after the screening, we'd talk to the people, and then Francis and I and Richard would meet for a day or two to discuss where to go next.
Yeah.
And then he would take off again, and then again, that would repeat maybe 4 weeks later.
I mean, your first assembly that you've said in the past was some 4.5 hours off, 150-page screenplay. How long was that process? How long was the editing process? I mean, we look at movies now, and I'm seeing huge films seem to have about 3-4 months to edit them, that the thinking time is almost taken out of the process. How long did you have with the conversation?
The first assembly was in May.
Yeah.
And let's call it the lock, was in October. So May, June, July, August, September. So maybe 4.5 months,
Yeah.
I think.
And was there a moment where you just felt that you had it, that you personally thought this is the cut? Do you ever have that level of certainty?
Yeah, I mean, it was a struggle. It was that screening in October.
Yeah.
I restructured the beginning of the film, jockeying scenes in different positions than they had been in the screenplay.
Yeah.
And that seemed to unlock some deep problem with people getting involved. The concept behind the concept with Francis was that he wanted to combine the Hitchcock and Hermann Hesse.
Yeah.
So the kind of murder mystery of a Hitchcock, and then the character study of Steppenwolf about this anonymous person. And those are two elements that don't really go together very easily.
I heard if you fill me in a little bit once in a while, did you ever think of that?
It has nothing to do with me, and even less to do with you.
It's curiosity. Did you ever hear of that? It's just goddamn human nature.
Listen, if there's one surefire rule that I have learned in this business is that I don't know anything about human nature. I don't know anything about curiosity. That's not part of what I do. This is my business, and when I'll
see you later.
So that was the struggle in the film, was trying to get those two elements, his own personal life, the Gene Hackman character, and then the story, the dangerous story that he was getting involved in, how to balance those. And if we had too much of one and not enough of the other, people would say, get rid of all that character stuff. I want the murder mystery. And if it was the opposite, they'd say, get rid of that phony murder mystery. I want the character study. So it was all a question of finding the right chemical balance between those two elements. And that really kind of happened in October of 1973.
And when did you get a sense of what audiences were expecting? Again, you've been fairly candid about audiences saw the film expecting some mix of Watergate and the French Connection and the Godfather, and didn't quite expect what they got.
Yeah.
It took a little bit of time for the film, outside of the Palme d'Or win, for the film to get fully the acclaim I think it deserved. Did you feel that at the time? Was that quite raw for you?
Well, we finished the film, we mixed it. It got released on Francis's birthday in April of 73 in the United States, and it got very good reviews.
Yes.
The criticism that there was just what you put your finger on, that this was a film directed by the man who did Godfather, starring the actor Gene Hackman, who had just been in the French Connection, and Watergate was really heating up. And the film is not sensational in any of those senses.
Yeah.
It operates on a different wavelength. So, people who went to see it in theaters in April and May in the United States were probably a little confused about what they were being asked to look at. But, that was the film Francis wanted to make, and that's what he got made. And then it did win the Palme d'Or in Cannes in 74, and then it got nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards that following year. It won a number of BAFTAs, so it did get a lot of respect.
I think it's Tom Hanks who's more recently been talking about the thing that completes the circle of a film's reception is time. It's interesting what you're saying about, for Francis, they're expecting The Godfather. For Gene Hackman, they're expecting The French Connection. Now it's revered in many places as the best work of both of them. Did you get a sense over time that it was getting its dues a bit more, outside of like the Oscar nominations and the Palme d'Or, of course?
Yeah, the reviewers respected it. Didn't do great business.
Yeah.
I think it barely made its money back. It was a $2 million film, and I think it made $4 million. It wasn't The Godfather, which had just made 100 million. So, that's the difference between a critical analysis and the audience expectations during the release of a film in the theaters.
I've not yet done a piece of work in my career that someone wants to revisit 40 or 50 years after I've done it. And I'm just curious, how do you reflect on that? This film that a 28-year-old who took the leap off the cliff to edit it in the first place is now held up in the way that it is.
It's one of those miracles of cinema history, I guess. When you launch into a film, you never know how it's going to be finished at the time, what the audience is going to say at the moment of release, what the critics are going to say, what the academies are going to say, and then what history is going to say. So I'm super happy that it has such a long life. It could have been otherwise. Many things could have happened slightly differently. If it hadn't been released in the same year as Godfather 2, there would have been probably some lingering question of why is there such a delay between the shooting of this film and its release? Is there something wrong with it? And that could have affected its critical reception. But thankfully, that didn't happen.
It's also become a tremendous movie pub quiz question. 1 in every 2 movie pub quizzes I sit through ask what is the other film that was nominated for Best Picture directed by Francis Ford Coppola that year. And the conversation gets extra name checked for that. Walter Murch, this has been an absolute delight, and thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
And hopefully we can chat again at some point. That would be amazing.
Sure, absolutely.
The Conversation is back on the big screen at selected cinemas nationwide from the 5th of July 2024. And then it's released in a limited collector's edition 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray set and on digital from the 15th of July. Now it's time for our regular news update from the world of StudioCanal. And how about this to get us started? Since the last episode, the first trailer for the eagerly awaited Paddington in Peru has been released. Paddington Bear is back on the big screen from the 8th of November. And just to lift all of our spirits, here's a little taste of the new trailer.
Dear Aunt Lucy, I have very important news. We're coming to visit you. The Browns are coming to Peru.
Get ready, everyone! He's coming!
Oh, what a handsome boat.
Hola!
Smooth, strong, easy on the eye, and that's just the boat. Voila!
Aunt Lucy! Paddington, we're here! Aunt Lucy!
I'm afraid she set off on some sort of quest deep in the jungle, and we have no idea where she is.
Aunt Lucy found me when I was a cub. Now I have to find her.
A bit more Paddington news too. Both Paddington and Paddington 2, I can confirm, are returning to UK cinemas. The pair are getting a fresh big screen outing in October this year, ahead of the release of the new film. Keep an eye out on your local cinema listings for screening details. Then, just a home release to put on your radar as well. Available in steelbook format, as well as Blu-ray and standard 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray, is Soldier Blue. This is part of the Cult Classics line of titles, a 1970 Western from director Ralph Nelson, starring Candice Bergen, Peter Strauss and Donald Pleasance. A controversial movie on release, thanks to its graphic violence, is a fierce piece of cinema that arrives on disc from the 15th of July 2024. I'll be back soon with the next episode of StudioCanal Presents. Until the next time, to get all the news on StudioCanal films as it happens, and to find out more about the ITVX, Apple TV and Prime Video channels, you can visit www.studiocanal.co.uk or follow StudioCanal at StudioCanal UK on X, Instagram and TikTok. Now, if you don't mind, I'm just off to check that nobody's recording my conversations. Ta-ta for now.